مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. وقعت تونس مذكرة تفاهم مع الاتحاد الأوروبي تهدف بصورة جزئية إلى الحد من الهجرة غير الشرعية، وشمل اتفاق الشراكة الاستراتيجية مجالات أخرى بينها التنمية الاقتصادية والطاقة المتجددة. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا ريكاردو فابياني مدير مشروع شمال إفريقيا في مجموعة الأزمات الدولية. أستاذ ريكاردو مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you for the invite.
دعنا نبدأ بما نعرفه عن اتفاق الشراكة الاستراتيجية بين تونس والاتحاد الأوروبي. ما الذي ستستفيده تونس وعلى ماذا سيحصل الأوروبيون؟
The text of the document signed by the parties, namely Europe and Tunisia, remains, I would say, quite vague. There are not many details that explain really what they're trying to do. There are a lot of different issues that are discussed in the document, mainly economic issues and migration issues, but I would say the text of the document is quite light on details. What we can, I would say, understand from what is written in the agreement is that there is a real interest by Europe to, first of all, help Tunisia in this delicate economic situation and the difficult economic conditions that the country is going through, particularly in terms of external financing. And of course, on the other hand, there is a real concern by the Europeans on migration. There is a real desire by the European Union and the EU member states that Tunisia could become a partner in managing migration flows, and therefore a significant, I would say, a fairly significant amount of money is made available to Tunisia so that it can, let's say, participate and make sure that they not only control the migration flows, but they also accept the return of a significant number of migrants back on Tunisian territory. I would say these are probably the two most important elements in that document.
هناك شيء غريب هنا، وكأن الاتحاد الأوروبي يكافئ تونس بعد التصعيد الأخير ضد المهاجرين الأفارقة، أليس كذلك؟
I think that is correct. That is true that the Europeans don't seem to be particularly bothered or worried about what is happening inside Tunisia with sub-Saharan migrants. They're turning a blind eye to the conditions and the treatments of these migrants. They're also ignoring the, I would say, dangerous, aggressive rhetoric coming from Tunisia, even from the highest authorities in the country, towards the black migrant population in Tunisia. And in a way, they are deciding that this is not important. What is important is actually that Tunisia collaborates in the management of migration flows. So Europe here is really accepting an exchange. They are accepting that they cannot really do anything and they don't really want to do anything regarding Tunisian domestic politics and the treatment of migrants. And as long as Tunisia accepts to manage these flows. The reason for this, I would say, exchange, for this sort of deal, is that the Europeans are worried about the numbers of migrant departures from Tunisia. They've seen, I would say, significant increase over the past months in terms of irregular departures from the Tunisian coasts, mostly because of the economic situation, which is obviously not easy. And it's not just sub-Saharan migrants who are trying to leave Tunisia, it's also Tunisians themselves who are doing this. And also because of the political situation. Of course, there is a delicate and at times, I would say, chaotic transition in Tunisia that also allows for this to happen. So it's true that the Europeans are just looking at one thing, really, in this moment. They don't want Tunisia to collapse economically. They want to keep it up to make sure that Tunisia remains a partner, and they want to make sure that there is a collaboration on migration. On everything else, they are really willing and ready to just ignore any problems.
توقيع تونس والاتحاد الأوروبي اتفاق الهجرة هل يعني إعادة توطين المهاجرين في البلد الإفريقي؟
I would say it's both things. One is for sure helping and reinforcing the capabilities of the Tunisian state in terms of patrolling and controlling the coasts and the departure points all along Tunisia. This is a kind of collaboration that has always been in place. The problem is that in the past few months, the control and the ability of the Tunisian authorities to control the coasts has, I would say, has been reduced quite significantly. And then there is a second point, which is Tunisia accepting the repatriation of migrants, which is what the Europeans would really like Tunisia to start doing. And here I would say it's where things become a little bit more complicated, because the Tunisian authorities, and particularly President Kais Saied, doesn't really want to do that. He's been complaining about having to play the role of the policeman for Europe, of accepting these migrants, because he fears that the number of sub-Saharan migrants in Tunisia could increase to the point of diluting the Tunisian population and also almost replacing the Tunisian Arab population. This is the great replacement theory, conspiracy theory that the president seems to believe in. So that's where I would say most of the tension on migration has been between Europe and Tunisia. Right now, it looks like Tunisia has accepted that there will be repatriations, but we don't know whether this will actually work, because it could end soon. There could be suspensions and problems and misunderstandings between the two sides. And to me, it remains unclear if the president will really accept that, given that he said very clearly that he doesn't really want to play the role of the policeman for Europe on migration.
أفهم من حديثك أن تونس وقعت تحت ضغط الأزمة الاقتصادية.
I think the economic component of this document is a very important one. That's for sure. That's very clear. The president is under a lot of pressure economically, given that there is no agreement between the IMF and Tunisia, and the president is rejecting the possibility of a loan from the IMF, and at the same time, Tunisia doesn't really have any other sources of revenues that they can use to pay off their debt. And Tunisia has a significant amount of debt that it will need to repay in the next months. And everyone now is asking the question of what will happen to Tunisia. Will there be a debt default, a bankruptcy of Tunisia in the next months? And will Tunisia follow the path of Lebanon, for example? So these fears are very high in the minds of everyone here. And the president doesn't seem to know exactly what he wants to do, whether he wants to renegotiate a deal with the IMF or he wants a default. And I think the negotiations with the European Union really come into this picture, and the president is really considering alternatives to the IMF. And this additional money coming from the European Union, I think, is something that definitely is important from the Tunisian perspective. And there is a lot of pressure, of course, on Kais Saied, and he needs some support for his strategy, for his transition, and whatever he's doing in Tunisia. So I think all of these factors, especially the economic component, really have, in a way, put pressure, significant pressure on a president that normally doesn't really like pressure and doesn't really respond well to pressure. But in this case, he seems to have had at least initially accepted the idea of accepting a deal with the Europeans.
باعتقادك هل من أوجه شبه واختلاف بين الاتفاق مع تونس والاتفاق مع تركيا الذي وقع قبل سنوات؟
Absolutely. I think there is definitely, from the European side, a clear desire to establish the same kind of partnership with Tunisia. The Europeans really liked what they managed to achieve with Turkey, and they believe that this is the model that they want to replicate, and this is something they would like to do again in the case of Tunisia. They believe that Tunisia is in a difficult situation, therefore they can try and leverage and pressure Tunisia to accept this kind of arrangement. Now, the difference, though, is in the fact that Turkey has accepted, I would say, with enthusiasm or with a certain, let's say, desire to participate this kind of trade-off, this kind of deal. They negotiated with the Europeans, and eventually they made it work for themselves. With Tunisia, the problem is that it's not clear if the president really wants this deal. He has accepted it, but the implementation of the deal remains very unclear, and he could easily back out of this deal. It could easily, interrupt the implementation of it at some point. So I think the type of model of migration management between the European Union and Turkey is very hard to replicate exactly in the same way in Tunisia.
في ضمن سياق هذا الاتفاق، هل يستطيع الاتحاد الأوروبي وضع شروط على تونس فيما يتعلق بطريقة التعامل مع المهاجرين غير الشرعيين، أم أن تونس ستعتبر ذلك تدخلاً في شؤونها الداخلية؟
I think this is going to be one of the biggest problems in the implementation of this deal, because it's very clear that this president does not accept any form of foreign interference, and is very, I would say, paranoid about foreign interferences, foreign involvement, and whatever, especially Western countries or European countries want to impose or want to get from Tunisia. He has a very, I would say, specific understanding of what Tunisia, an independent and sovereign Tunisia, should be like. And this kind of deal was negotiated for weeks. It was not easy to negotiate. The Europeans said very clearly that there were problems, and the Tunisian officials were not particularly keen and easy to deal with, unlike what happened in the past. And of course, we've also seen the incidents, the violent attacks against sub-Saharan migrants recently in Sfax, but even before that happened a few months ago with a similar dynamic, the president effectively covering or at least partly justifying these kind of violences against sub-Saharan migrants. And what will happen if these kind of incidents happen again? What kind of reaction from the European public opinion, from European political parties, particularly on the left, there will be if Europe is dealing with a political system that at the same time is also allowing for this kind of violences against migrants. I think this is a real issue, and the Europeans so far have avoided commenting on these incidents, on these episodes. But this creates a problem for Europe. This creates obviously a risk of instability and violence in Tunisia. It also creates a problem in the relations between the Europeans and the other sub-Saharan African governments, because we know that the African Union and other African countries have complained with President Kais Saied about the treatment of sub-Saharan migrants. So if these episodes continue, I think Europe will be in a very difficult position and will be forced to take some very uncomfortable stances on this whole problem.
هل يسعى الاتحاد الأوروبي لشراكة مماثلة مع مصر، مع المغرب، مع ليبيا والجزائر؟
So I think that there are already some attempts by European governments to have similar arrangements with other countries in the region. We've seen in the past few months the Italian government negotiating migration agreements, or starting to negotiate migration agreements with the Tripoli government in Libya, and then welcoming, for example, General Haftar from eastern Libya to talk about migration. So this is a concern that, for example, the Italians also have very high in mind when it comes to Libya. There is obviously the issue of migration in Morocco, particularly in relationship with Spain. And we've seen in the past few weeks migration numbers going up from Morocco to the Canary Islands and parts of Spain. And there is a fear that Morocco might be trying to use migration to influence the Spanish elections, or at least to send a message, a signal that they do believe that the next government should behave in a certain way regarding, for example, the issue of Western Sahara. So there are all these migration problems, I would say, popping up everywhere along North Africa that the Europeans are very worried about. The issue is that it's very hard for any of these governments in North Africa to accept the kind of deal that the Europeans would like to impose on them. These countries don't want to have a Turkey-style agreement on migration. They believe that the cost of accepting, repatriation and dealing with, asylum seekers or migrants on their territory would be just too high. And they don't want to do this because the Europeans cannot really offer enough money and enough support for them to accept this kind of arrangement. So I think there is a desire, there's a wish by the Europeans to do this. There is I would say, instrumentalization and exploitation of migration by the North African states. But there is also, I would say, a gap, and there is not enough interest by North African governments to get into this same kind of arrangement as in Turkey or even in the case of Tunisia.
أستاذ ريكاردو فابياني، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you very much for the invite.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.